You open your eyes in the morning. You believe you have returned to reality. But here is the brutal physical reality. Being awake does not actually exist. It is merely a hallucination forced into alignment by sensory data. Your brain has never directly touched the outside world. It is absolutely sealed inside a pitch-black skull. The waking life you are experiencing right now, at its core biological mechanism, is completely identical to a deep dream. The only difference is the external audio-visual signals. They restrict this neurological simulation. Once you sever these external data feeds, the unconstrained rendering engine of the brain goes into overdrive. Watch closely how they react. A 28-year-old male lies flat on a bed. His limb muscles are completely relaxed. Suddenly, his torso convulses violently. His chest expands rapidly as he sharply inhales. His eyes snap open instantly. His hands grip the bedsheets with lethal force. His knuckles turn completely white from the extreme tension. Cardiac pacemaker cells receive a massive sympathetic nerve electrical signal. His heart rate spikes from 60 to 95 beats per minute in 3 seconds. Actual cold sweat pours from his forehead. His subjective consciousness firmly believes he just fell off a cliff. But the actual fatal mechanism is, that cliff simply does not exist in physical space. No actual gravitational acceleration acted upon his vestibular system. All the spatial geometry data, all the freefall velocity, all the extreme near, death, terror were fabricated entirely by his central nervous system, rendered with 100% physical realism inside an insulated skull. And it gets worse. The human brain can fabricate an absolutely convincing physical environment out of nothing. This environment possesses a tyrannical level of oppression. It can forcefully bypass your logical cortex. It directly forces your cardiopulmonary system to trigger a maximum survival defense. And all of this requires zero actual external photons to trigger. If the computing power of this internal rendering engine is so massive, if it can perfectly deceive all your physiological metrics, what exact precision mechanism is synthesizing your current so-called reality? When this neural synthesis mechanism completely crashes, where will the you inside this flesh vessel be instantly exiled? Human lifespan is forcefully severed for exactly 1/3 of your total physical time. For a span of roughly 17 years, your subjective consciousness is not merely resting. It is subjected to complete physical eradication. This is a neural massacre executed with daily precision. The thinking and remembering you is forcibly powered down by the system. This is absolutely not simple dormancy. It is a functional existential erasure. You lose your status as an observer in this universe. But here is the brutal physical reality. This stems from the neural control of deep non-REM sleep. The default mode network of the brain is massively downgraded. This neural network, responsible for autobiographical memory and self-awareness, has its blood supply and electrical signal transmission brutally severed. Brainwave frequencies experience a cliff-like drop. You fully enter the slow wave phase dominating deep sleep. Neurons can only sustain ultra-low frequency potential oscillations, displaying extreme amplitude delta waves between 0.5 and 4 Hz. Frequency, beta, and gamma waves completely vanish. This means the brain loses the capacity to bind fragmented sensory data without the stitching effect of these high-frequency oscillations. The entity known as the self instantly disintegrates. The perception of the passage of time is totally stripped away. The coordinate system of three-dimensional space is completely destroyed. This is the closest physiological state to clinical brain death that a carbon-based organism can reach while maintaining autonomic breathing. Watch closely how they react. A female is in the 4th stage of deep sleep. A heavy wooden bedroom door is slammed shut by massive physical force. The massive sound wave instantly penetrates the air medium and strikes her eardrum. Her body does not shift by even a single millimeter. The eyeballs beneath her eyelids remain in an absolute deadlock state. The rise and fall of her chest maintains an exact frequency of 12 breaths per Inute. Her auditory cortex actually captures the violent decibel fluctuation perfectly. The physical sound wave is faithfully converted into a neural electrical signal. But the actual fatal mechanism is the thalamus, acting as the central relay station, issues an absolute blockade. It severs all physical pathways for the signal to travel upward to the cerebral cortex. External environmental stimuli are fully processed by the underlying hardware, but an awake observer no longer exists inside her brain to perceive it. This reveals a remarkably cruel biological truth. Maintaining a continuous awake self-consciousness is highly toxic. It is an unbearable metabolic drain on the brain. The extremely high energy cost generates massive amounts of neurotoxic waste. To prevent this biological machine from collapsing, the brain must periodically execute a system-level death sentence on the self-consciousness. During this void vacuum period where you are erased, only then can the glymphatic system intervene on a massive scale, forcibly flushing and clearing out those lethal protein garbage. And it gets worse. The carbon-based brain cannot endure this absolute neural silence for long. After 90 minutes of nothingness, the underlying code must resurrect the murdered self. But before doing so, it must execute an extreme defense protocol. It will inject chemical agents to completely paralyze the entire muscular system of this biological host. To safely dive into this neural simulation known as dreaming, the brain must forcefully sever its physical connection to the entire somatic muscle system. It personally turns its own biological container into a high-level, paraplegic shell. But here is the brutal physical reality. This paralysis protocol, defined as atonia, is incredibly ruthless. The brainstem begins to frantically secrete and send inhibitory neurotransmitters downstream. High concentrations of glycine and GABA form a chemical blockade. They accurately snipe the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. Simultaneously, the activation synthesis program inside the skull is forcefully booted up. The amygdala, responsible for extreme fear and violent emotions, goes into complete overdrive, while the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic and impulse control, suffers extremely brutal electrical signal suppression. This highly distorted neurochemical environment directly forces the brain to experience extremely intense and irrational visual narratives. While you cannot move a fraction of a millimeter in the physical world, you also completely lose the computational power to logically refute these absurdities. Watch closely how they react. A male in the REM phase is lying supine on a bed. His autonomic breathing becomes extremely shallow and highly irregular. The eyeballs beneath his eyelids are executing high-frequency saccadic movements. Aside from a few fingers exhibiting unconscious micro-twitches, his core muscles and limbs are in a state of absolute flaccid paralysis. Inside his neural simulator, the system commands him to sprint at full speed to evade a lethal attack. His motor cortex instantly erupts with incredibly intense electrical discharges. The biological electrical signals that perfectly drive the legs to run are precisely dispatched. But the actual, fatal mechanism is these violent electrical signals are entirely physically intercepted the moment they reach the spinal cord. They are trapped dead inside that chemical barrier built by neurotransmitters. When this paralysis protocol suffers physical damage, REM sleep behavior disorder will tear apart the boundary of reality. Catastrophic physical destruction will inevitably occur. The body, devoid of muscle lock, erupts with extremely violent limb movements. They will smash their heavy fists into solid concrete walls, or strangle the carotid artery of the partner sleeping beside them. Their central nervous system firmly believes they are in hand-to-hand combat with a physical invader. And it gets worse. These brutal clinical manifestations thoroughly prove one point: that dream reality, generated entirely by the brain's computing power, possesses the supreme executive authority to completely override and crush the physical objective environment. Why would the brain frantically burn massive metabolic energy while trapped in this highly vulnerable state of absolute paralysis, to forcibly render such extremely realistic and terrifying disaster simulations. Dreams are never mysterious prophetic revelations, nor are they repressed psychological desires of the subconscious. This is simply a highly brutal evolutionary survival algorithm. It is a highly efficient stress testing program, hard-coded into the base of human genetics. Carbon-based organisms survived millions of years of physical elimination, simply because the central nervous system constantly applies pressure to itself. The brain utilizes the safe window of total physical paralysis to frantically run the most extreme lethal threat simulations. But here is the brutal physical reality. The underlying logic of this threat simulation mechanism is highly precise. The locus coeruleus is forcefully activated by system commands. It begins pumping high concentrations of noradrenaline into all brain regions. The brain starts forcibly synthesizing maximum intensity social and physical threats, public humiliation, or falling into the abyss, or being hunted by predators. These lethal scenarios force the fight-or-flight neural pathways to fire at high frequencies. Dopaminergic circuits are constantly tempered in this extreme simulation. Neural synapses complete their remodeling in an insulated environment with zero physical risk. The host's stress response speed is violently elevated. Watch closely how they react. A university student is in the REM sleep phase. A blank final exam paper appears in his subjective visual field. His biological body instantly begins to secrete massive amounts of sweat. The adrenal cortex pumps a large volume of cortisol directly into the bloodstream. The opening and closing frequency of his heart valves spikes violently. Inside the neural-synthesized virtual classroom, he tries to open his vocal cords to ask the professor at the podium for help. But the actual fatal mechanism is the laryngeal muscle group receives absolutely no commands from the motor cortex. This is a perfect neural replication of the primal freeze response. His physical body is paying a real physiological price for entirely fake visual data, and it gets worse. The human brain has absolutely no capacity to distinguish between fake and real. It cannot differentiate between simulated stress in a dream and real-world trauma during the day. If this body is exposed to sustained chronic high stress while awake, this threat simulator will immediately fall into a dead loop. It triggers highly destructive post-traumatic stress disorder, night terrors. The defense system, originally meant to protect the organism, begins a frantic backlash. The sustained high-concentration cortisol toxicity starts physically corroding the hippocampus. The biological structure of the cardiovascular system is completely destroyed by these endless false alarms. If the underlying rendering engine of the brain is so tyrannical that it can forcefully hijack your entire endocrine system, forcing your organs to react realistically to a fabricated room, making you break out in a cold sweat over a non-existent exam and professor, then what absolute clinical medical persuasiveness do all the sensory evidence you currently use to perceive this world possess? How can you use rigorous physical methods to prove that this so-called reality room you perceive right now is not just another neural simulation currently running? Perceiving external reality and generating a deep dream within the underlying code of neurology, there is a despairing zero difference. But here is the brutal physical reality. According to the cold deduction of predictive coding theory, your brain is a prediction machine imprisoned in absolute darkness. It is completely physically insulated by an extremely hard skull. It has never from birth truly seen the outside world even once. It can only passively receive those extremely ambiguous bioelectrical impulses, the photon potentials transmitted by the optic nerve, the mechanical vibrations captured by the auditory nerve, the faint pressure conducted by tactile receptors. The brain can only hold these fragmented data pieces and frantically blind guess the external physical form in the darkness of the cranial base. The actual fatal mechanism is, a dream is merely this prediction engine, freewheeling at full power after the external sensory data validation is completely cut off. The phenomenon of false awakenings completely exposes this bug. It proves the brain possesses the terrifying computing power to seamlessly nest multiple layers of virtual reality. It can directly extract the spatial maps from your memory storage area and use these maps to construct a flawless physical cage out of thin air. Watch closely how they react. An individual sits up in a nested false awakening. The soles of his feet genuinely step onto the wooden floor of the bedroom. Cold receptors frantically transmit icy tactile sensations to the brain. He walks toward the narrow bathroom, reaches out and grabs the plastic toothpaste tube on the sink. The pressure sensation on the fingertips and the deformation feedback of the tube are utterly flawless. Even the microparticle friction of the plastic surface is accurately rendered, but he focuses his vision on the printed instructions of the toothpaste tube. Those originally clear letters begin to twist frantically. The strokes of the text rapidly reorganize and dismantle like living creatures. Because Wernicke's area and Broca's area, which govern language processing, are in a state of deep dormant power, down, during, sleep. This physics engine, with godlike computing power, paradoxically fails to render a structurally stable character system. This extremely minute computation glitch barely tears open the disguise of this perfect neural simulation. And it gets worse. This marks the total collapse of absolute cognitive certainty. Any physical test you try to use right now to prove you are awake, whether it is pinching your skin hard to create pain, or turning your head to check the hands of a wall clock ticking, or even invoking your prefrontal lobe to recall the details of yesterday. These tests themselves can be perfectly faked by this neural simulator. Pain signals can be generated out of nowhere and sent downward by the cortex. Visual images can be forcibly overwritten by the hippocampus. You are permanently deadlocked inside the brain's internal user interface. You will never touch even a single millimeter of base reality in your entire life. But here is the brutal physical reality. The objective world is absolutely unreachable for this carbon-based flesh. You have never in any true sense experienced even 1 second of the physical world. All the grand narratives and micro-sensations you experience are merely the cerebral cortex's forced compilation of a pile of electrochemical signals. Whether external photons penetrate the lens to accurately bombard your retina, or synapses frantically fire spontaneously in the dead of night during REM sleep, there is zero difference to this absolutely closed neural computing matrix. The nervous system simply does not care about the initial physical source of the data. The actual fatal mechanism is, as long as that high concentration of cortisol truly pierces your blood vessel walls, as long as your heart's sinoatrial node is forcefully elevated in its electrophysiological rhythm, as long as the neuroplasticity of the cerebral cortex is remodeled by these signals, then this fully closed neural simulation happening inside your skull is the only absolute reality you will ever possess. And it gets worse. The vast majority of people spend their entire lives trying to control the external environment. They try to regulate internal feelings by altering the fake exterior. This is a highly foolish and ineffective operation on the biological underlying logic. You have never truly interacted with the so-called physical reality. The only thing you are constantly interacting with from birth to death is your own central nervous system. You must immediately stop your futile interference with the external hallucination. Watch closely how they react. An individual trying to seize back system control never tangles with the exterior. Every morning he forces his eyes to be exposed to specific lux of natural light. High-energy photon streams pierce the retina and go straight to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. He uses physical optics to forcefully reset the biological clock code of every cell in his body. He changes the diaphragm pressure through extremely deep physical breathing, directly applying high-intensity mechanical force stimulation to the somatic vagus nerve, forcibly dragging the autonomic nervous system out of an out-of-control sympathetic storm. He no longer tries to change the surface pixel graphics of this neural simulation. Instead, he directly modifies the biological hardware parameters running this program at the base level. When you completely master the physical parameters of this carbon-based machine, using extremely strict circadian rhythms to physically anchor your endocrine system, you can absolutely rule the final output quality of this neural simulation, regardless of whether you are physically awake or asleep at this moment. If you want to completely understand the extremely precise mechanisms controlling your current simulation, subscribe to this channel immediately. The next video will break down from an extremely hardcore neurochemical level how the modern physical environment is violently hacking your predictive coding system.